Okay, we are at a very unique place in 2 Corinthians, and the reason I say that is because the issue that Paul is about to address, he's about to make a comparison. He's going to compare the glory of the ministry of Moses. We kind of called that the external ministry, the ministry of the law, that kind of thing, with the ministry of the Spirit. And they're two very different ministries. Both of them are from God. Both of them can be abused. Both of them can be misunderstood. Both ministries have a point and have a purpose, and that's what we need to discover tonight. What the whole point and purpose of each one of these ministries, the way God wanted them to be used. And I found out really quick in studying this that this is a passage that, not that I just need to give to you, but we actually need to talk about. Because I don't know how to say this any other way, but this passage is going to be very personal. It doesn't look that way, but it's going to be very personal because this is going to deal with people that you know in your life that are your friends and are your family, people you go to work with, people that maybe you go to school with. They are going to be in one of two ministries if they claim to be a follower of Jesus. They're going to be in the ministry of Moses, the ministry of the law, or they're going to be a part of the ministry of the Spirit. There's only two. You know, if it's from God, there's only two. There are two ministries, but they're very different. The end results are very different, and the approach is very different, and both have a different purpose. So we need to talk about this because we're going to be addressing this. We're going to be addressing people, even today, that are still being affected by the ministry of Moses. And we're going to explain that and talk about that for a little while. The first thing that we need to notice about the Corinthian church is they had Jews that came there, and they acquired the name false teachers from Paul. They were teaching the law of Moses. Moses wasn't called a false teacher, was he? He was teaching the law. He was teaching God's Old Testament law, and he wasn't called a false teacher. So what do you think the difference was between Moses and the people that were teaching to the Corinthian church? Why is one group of people called false teachers and the other group of people are just called men sent from God? How could both people that are doing similar things and teaching the same thing, one be called a prophet or somebody sent from God or a messenger from God, and the other person to be called a false teacher teaching a heresy? You ever thought about that? A couple of things that we need to note about the law and about this ministry of the law. It was very external. And if you think about it, it makes complete sense to call it that, because the law itself was an external thing. It was written on stone, and the various laws were written on with pen and paper, so it was an external thing. But also think about the other ceremonial things, the washings, the festivals, the circumcision, gifts, sacrifices, on and on and on we go, and it's about things on the outside, right? A lot of what you talk about when you talk about the Mosaic law, it's an outward thing. It's an outward experience. And so this whole ministry is about ceremony, and it was about sacraments, and it was about ritual. And it was completely from God. It was completely from God. And it had a complete point and purpose from God too. But here's the problem. We know from this passage, let's just go ahead and read it. And we know from this passage that it wasn't supposed to last. I'm going to start in verse 7. It says, "Now if the ministry that brought death, which was engraved in letters on stone, came with glory, so that the Israelites could not look steadily at the face of Moses because of its glory, transitory transitory, transitory though it was, will not the ministry of the Spirit be even more glorious? If the ministry that brought condemnation was glorious, how much more glorious is the ministry that brings righteousness? For what was glorious has no glory now in comparison with the surpassing glory. And if what was transitory came with glory, how much greater is the glory of that which lasts? So it wasn't supposed to continue on. But let me ask you this question. Has this ministry continued on? This was a ministry of externals. It was a ministry of ceremony, of ritual, of rites. Has that ministry continued on? I'm asking that as like a real question.
In other words, you want an answer.
I want an answer. Has this ministry continued on?
Yeah.
It was not supposed to, but has it?
Yes.
I think it has, but not
Okay.
in the same way that it did.
Okay. Well, how did it continue on? Let's start at the very beginning. How did it continue on when it shouldn't have in Paul's time, in Paul's day? How did it continue on there?
Well, you had Judaizers that were still teaching, exactly that you needed to do exactly what they did when they were under Moses' law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's about at least 4 churches that we can think of in the New Testament that were affected by the continuing of the ministry of Moses, this external ministry that was continuing on. That's why Paul, he wrote some of his letters directly addressing the issue. Okay, now let's fast forward just a little bit in history, not to present day, but what has been affected by the ministry of Moses a little bit further along in history. Think about what is very ceremonial, very ritualistic, very external in its practices.
Are you looking for a religious group?
Yes.
The Catholics.
Okay. What else? There's more.
The Jews.
Yeah, they stayed that way, of course. But it has its problems in the Christian ranks. There's one more, like very specific one, if you can think about it. It's Greek Orthodox. Yeah, Greek Orthodox. They're very external, very ceremonial. Okay, now we can see where it's continuing, right? It's transferring over. Okay, and we said the Roman Catholic Church, right? Okay, let's fast forward now to today. We know the Roman Catholic Church is still here today, but let's fast forward to right here, right now, in our Bible Belt believing South, our area. How is it being continued on now? This is the hard question, and this is where it gets a little more personal. But how is it continuing on? Now, one thing that I can tell you is that almost all the churches that you see that are planted in this area, almost all of them stem from the Roman Catholic Church. If you look at a branch, if you look at where it branches off, almost all of our churches came from the Roman Catholic.
But
So
most of them are also a product of the Protestant Reformation, though, right?
yes, true. But it's.
But they brought a lot of that junk.
Mm-hmm.
with them.
It's easy to transfer those things over. Okay, so this is going to get a little bit deeper. Okay, how is that happening right here in our hometowns? How is this happening in our daily life from what we can see? This is a little bit harder to answer, but we need to talk about this, and we need to be able to see it, and we need to be able to address it. How is it happening right now?
Are you talking about an external law, or are you talking about the law of Moses?
I'm talking about the law of Moses. We said was it was all the focus was on the external.
Mm-hmm.
That's why it was ceremonial. It was the sacraments, the festivities. It was very ritualistic, and the works of the law, that kind of thing. That was the emphasis. Your works of the law, you going through the right ceremony and ritual and the right formula. Those things were very, very important. That was what the emphasis was on, and for a specific reason. But But has that transferred down the line? That's the question. Has it transferred down the line to here?
Are you talking
How
about
is
a
it?
certain kind of church? Or-
No, I'm just talking about the practices. I'm not talking. I don't want us to name churches. Okay,
Right.
I'm just talking about practices.
I think so, because I think most of us have been in different churches where certain things have been done as a tradition for
Mm-hmm.
50 or 100 years.
Mhm.
And that's the reason why they're still done, is because it's a tradition,
Mm-hmm.
which would be an external law.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It was like when we were talking about it, I said, you know, to me, what comes to mind is that it's so easy to compartmentalize your so-called commitment to God, you know, and put it in this little slot of time where you do these rituals and you feel like you've done your thing, and then you can go to just living your life.
Yeah. It makes things easier, doesn't it? Because you can complete the external tasks that are at hand, and you move on. You move on with your life, and it doesn't require anything from your heart, does it? You can just do the things a lot of times, you know, and many times we have a lower standard of the law. People that actually live by law now, it's not really God's law. It's like a lower standard of it, one that they can kind of, you know, keep up with a little bit. And so yeah, that's what they'll do. They'll go through and have their acts, have their things that they do. But what are some other ways? And we need to be specific about like the practices that are focused on. Think about things that get the attention and the focus that are external. What kind of things get that attention? How is that kind of how does that steal the focus and the attention? Because that's what they were talking about. You have to be circumcised. You have to observe this, and you have to observe these special days, and you have to go through this festival. You have to celebrate the new moon feast. You have to celebrate these things. You have to go through these things, and it was all the emphasis of you going through the external motions of whatever God's law pointed out. But that same, not the same. Like we don't have a new moon celebration now, right? Nobody does that really. We don't have. We don't have a circumcision ceremony. You know, we don't have those things now. But
We have the Lord's Supper, and it's the way we have come to observe it has become just a checklist, sacramental thing that we do. You know, it's something that we need to do, but it's meaningless if it's not from the heart.
yeah,
And we've made it easy for it to be just a go through the motion thing.
yeah. For the people that have an emphasis on the external, like it's about having the right formula for worship. You know what I'm saying? Like, worship has to be this way. Because, and I'm not talking about the inside, I'm talking about in their minds they say externally it has to be this way. And it can be any other way but that. People that have that emphasis on the external, what happens if those things are changed? Or they're you know, tweaked a little, or there's a little bit of movement in those things. What typically happens?
Yeah, kind of an uproar.
Okay.
Well, when something's the law, there is no leeway.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when
Yeah.
that happens, then people get upset.
Mm-hmm. What is it that people feel like you're breaking? They feel like you're breaking the law, but what is their problem with you breaking that? What stock have they put in it?
Is that what you're
Mhm.
looking at?
Doing it
Yes.
that way forever.
Mm-hmm. But their tradition is they have put something in whatever external practice that they're afraid that you're breaking. What have they put into the external practice? They put something in it.
Their heart.
Yes.
Your trust.
Mm-hmm. Which another word for is for trust. They put their blank in an external practice,
Well,
thinking that the
their
external
hope-
practice. Huh?
Their hope of salvation. I mean.
Yes. That their salvation is connected to it, right? That's why sometimes somebody claps in worship, or somebody brings an instrument to some worship services, or some worship services don't have an organ, or some worship services don't have a praise team, or some do, and some this and that, and people get real finicky with that when we're free in that way, aren't we? As long as we're building up the church, we're free in those ways to worship, the way it best suits our church and the community that we're in. But people get real angry really fast because they feel like you're dealing with a salvation issue.
And it might be worth mentioning that in some cases, what they do that by taking an example of something that was mentioned in the New Testament and made a command or requirement out of it.
Yeah. And some will even say, if you continue to go down that route, you're going to go to hell. There was a church that they used some instruments in their worship, but they said if there was any addition besides the instruments they had, that would be a sin and you would go to hell. And it doesn't really make sense, but that's the emphasis on the external. That's what happens, right? When your emphasis is on the external, you put your faith in those external practices, and somebody starts messing with them, and somebody's going to get upset really quickly. Because when you put your faith into something, instead of your faith in totally Jesus, you start getting real finicky and real upset really quick. And I wanted you to see that the ministry of Moses has not died out like it was supposed to. It was supposed to fade out. It was supposed to come in for a time. But what does God's Word tell us that was the whole reason for the Old Testament? The old law, the ceremonial law. It kind of sums up what those things were for. Do you know what those things were for? Do you just off the top of your head?
In my mind, not just in my mind, but because this is what is said in places, is that it causes us to progress to the point that we realize we can't keep it. It makes us aware of our sin.
Yeah.
And that we've got to have something else.
Right.
Because I can't do this.
Okay. What's the something else that we got to have? If there's something else we got to have, and the law is making that evident to us, we got to have something else here. There's something missing, right? Isn't that what the law does? It says something's missing here. And God wanted it to do that. But what does it say what does the law point to the thing that's missing?
Grace.
Okay? But what wasn't there? What person wasn't there? Jesus.
It required a sacrifice.
Yes.
And the sacrifice had to be perfect.
Yeah, the blood of bulls and goats did not do what it needed to do. And what's neat about this situation is that in Colossians 2:17 and in Hebrews 10:1, it says that the law and the ceremonial, the Sabbaths, all that stuff was only a shadow of Jesus. It was a shadow of Jesus. It wasn't the real thing. You know what I'm saying? It just pointed to Jesus. And so the people of the Old Testament that looked at it that way, that looked at it as a symbol of that there needed to be something else, they looked at it in the right way. But there are people in the Mosaic Law, and there are people today, they look at the outer observances as if they are the real Jesus. I don't know if that makes sense to you. But they put their faith into the outer symbolic things about Jesus. Sometimes the things we do in worship is a symbol. The outer things that we take part in, they're symbols of Jesus, but they're not Jesus. And so people will do the same thing that the Israelites were doing, that the false teachers were doing in Corinth. They would try to replace Jesus with a sacrament, try to replace Jesus with their ritual, and try to replace Jesus with their ceremonial, formal worship. And then that's why they say, and this is how they do it. They say, if you don't do these things, if you don't go through these practices, then you're not going to be saved. Then you can't get God's grace. And so that's exactly what the Judaizers were teaching. They were saying, if you want God's grace, you want salvation, you've got to observe the law too. They were making it equal. They were saying, this Jesus thing is okay. It's all right. They didn't just reject Jesus. They said, this Jesus thing is okay, but in addition to that, you need to obey the law too. So you need these outer practices. And you know what Paul called that ministry that they were teaching? That you need more than that. You need this outer ministry, this outer practice. You need this external thing going on here. Paul said that is another gospel. That ministry is another gospel. And you know what he said about it? It's no gospel at all. It's no gospel at all. And he even said this: if you accept that ministry, if you let yourself be circumcised, like you do that so that you will be right in God's eyes, instead of by putting your faith in Jesus, you're putting your faith in circumcision, you're putting your faith in this external thing. If you accept that ministry that way, Paul says you have been cut off from Christ. You've been cut off. And that strikes me pretty hard. Because here's the thing that I've learned by looking at these two ministries. You don't get to accept both of them. You don't accept both of them. The old ministry, the external ministry, it was meant to point you to Jesus, so that you would do what? Accept Jesus. Not so that you would have the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, and the New Covenant at the same time, to have two covenants. No, God said that the New Covenant, it isn't going to be like the old one. It's not going to be anything like it. It's going to be completely different. And so I wanted to tell you that, because, and I want to be very careful how I say this, because it's very easy to sound judgmental and derogatory towards other people that have practices that are different, and that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm not talking about people that have preferences to worship this way and preferences to worship that way. I'm talking about people that have their preferences and their outer external things, and they rely on those things to save them. They say, we've got the correct formula for worship, and that's why I'm acceptable to God, and that's why I'm going to be saved in the end.
And then they go further and require it of others.
They go one step further, and they require it of other people. And let me tell you something, that is dangerous. And it is right here. And you know what? And it's in some of our families. That teaching is that you have to do these external things for God's grace. These external things have to be accomplished. That's that ministry talking there. These external things have to happen, or you're not going to be acceptable to Jesus. And Paul said that's not a gospel. That's another gospel that isn't a gospel at all. That's not good news at all. To say that saves you. You know, the thing was, the Old Testament, the old law was never meant to save you. It was never even designed to do that. The people of the Old Covenant were never supposed to lean on the law and say, this saves me. That wasn't the design of it. The design was to point to something else. To say, don't stop here. Don't camp out here. You need to be looking for something else. The law was a shadow of Jesus. The ceremonies, all of the rituals they went through, it was a shadow of Jesus Christ, but it wasn't Jesus himself. That's what Colossians 2:17 says. It says it wasn't the body himself. It wasn't the real Jesus. But we can replace Jesus sometimes. We replace him with the outer external things in our life sometimes. We see people that do that. They'll say, I believe in Jesus. You know, they'll make that statement. They'll claim themselves as a believer. Like the Roman Catholic Church, they claim themselves as believers in Jesus, but they also believe in the external ritual ceremony to be saved as well. And I was looking on the Roman Catholic website, and I was looking just at the things that they had as requirements for salvation and requirements for being acceptable to God, and those things were in there. And what it is it's an old approach, an old format to worship and to that experience. But here's the good news of this passage. There's a much, much, much more glorious, more beautiful ministry. It's so much more, it's so much better, so much bigger. It's not one that was supposed to end, it's one that's supposed to last on forever. And this is the ministry of the Spirit. Now, and the difference in the ministry of the Old Covenant and the ministry of the Spirit, one was supposed to point to Jesus, but the ministry of the Spirit is supposed to put him in you. It's supposed to put him in your heart. This is what Jesus promised in John chapter 14. He says, anybody that loves me will keep my commands, and then me and my Father will make our home in them. That was the promise. That was the promise of the new covenant. Means promise. This is the new promise. That we're going to make our home in you. So the old covenant pointed to Jesus, and then the ministry of the Spirit, the new covenant, it places Jesus. It places Jesus inside of you, so that you have Jesus living in you. You're not in search of Jesus, and you know what? You don't need something pointing to Jesus anymore. You don't need another outer practice that's symbolizing Jesus and this showing Jesus. You don't need to lean on that for your salvation anymore, because you got him right here. You don't need that to point to Jesus, because your heart's going to point to him. It talks about the law being written on your heart, and the law is a shadow of Jesus. If you've got that in your heart, you've got Jesus inside of you. And it says that this ministry it's not even comparable to the other one. And I think we need to be able to tell people, this is kind of what's been my dilemma, is telling people how we're different. How are we different from somebody else? Why should we go to your church when there's all these other churches everywhere else? And the difference is we believe in the ministry of the Spirit. And instead of it being externally focused, it is entirely internally focused. Where the other one was completely focused on the things on the outside of you and your outer works and practices, this one's completely dedicated and focused on the inside. It's focused on your heart and your mind, which controls all those other things. So there's people out there, and I think that they're involved in worship, and I'm not criticizing the different worshiping styles or anything, but there's some people out there that their church or their congregation or their religious organization, whatever it is, they have that high emphasis on that and not on the Spirit. And there's some people that maybe by the grace of God are asking this, man, there's got to be more than this. There's got to be more than what I'm experiencing here, because I leave empty, or I feel like maybe there's just more than what I see here. There is. There is more. There's so much more. It's so much more beautiful and more glorious, and they need to hear about it. And this is what I've been trying to teach, with my personal one-on-one Bible studies with somebody in particular that's very close to me. I'm begging him, please look at this ministry, because it is so much more beautiful. It is so much more meaningful. It has so much more power to transform your life than the other one does. The other one, it was fading out. It's old school. And in Galatians, Paul actually refers to it as the elemental spiritual forces. Like that was for when you were young and when you were little. And there's something else for you now. It's not elementary. It's not kindergarten. This is meant for you right now. It can be inside of you right now. And I just hope that we can see the glory. I wanted this lesson to kind of set up for the next one, because he's going to go even more in depth, and he's going to talk about how the old covenant kind of blinds people a little bit, and it doesn't allow them to see Jesus. And the thing about the Spirit of God, it says in John 16, it says that the Spirit of God it will glorify Jesus. And that's what we need. That's what we need people to see, is the glory of Jesus. Because then you want to be like him. You want to mimic your life like him. And people won't ever see Jesus for who he really is without the Spirit of God doing something. One ministry depends a whole lot on man, and the other ministry, it depends on God, and it depends on God's Spirit. And people need that for the transition to happen in their life. So I hope we can just go out and tell people that we're a church that's about the ministry of the Spirit, because it's so glorious, it is so beautiful. Let's pray together, and we'll close out.